I didn't do anything yet, so you don't need to clap. But yes, we're not going to talk about the nature thing. You can probably look online about it. But yes, we're going to talk about this other stuff. Okay, good. So a lot of you guys are doing sprints already. I'm not going to talk about any details about the sprint methodology. I'm more going to teach some related valuable concepts, which I think help to pull the whole thing together, like the sprints in the larger context of getting effective outcomes and also organizational change. And as mentioned in the intro, I was one of the founding team members of Google X, which is the organization that made the self-driving car. Glass, that's Project Wing. This is Project Loon. This is some geothermal shit. Nobody even heard about that. Anyway, this is a new approach to artificial intelligence as a contact lens that measures your glucose levels. And I think that when people hear about these projects, it's like, well, it's because Google has like so much money. Like they have so much money, they can explore stuff like this. They have so many great engineers, they can throw 100 people onto any project and make it work. They had all the time in the world to go do this. But just to reset your expectations a little bit, Project Loon, which has the small ambition of trying to provide internet access to every square inch of the earth, the first 100 hardware prototypes of Project Loon were produced in 4 months by just 5 people. So 100 hardware prototypes, 4 months, 5 people. And by the end of 100 hardware prototypes, we had multiple balloons up at 25 kilometers doing communications with each other and the ground. And the total amount of cost, like the prototyping material cost for that 100 prototypes, was $70,000. So that is not a lot of people. It's not a lot of time. That is not a lot of money. Like the difference was how we were working. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the ideas of how we were working. Alrighty, so when I joined Google, it was right at the beginning of Google X. It was so early that the division didn't have a name yet, and you couldn't talk about it. So I guess I was like entering a group that didn't exist. But luckily, there was like 8 other people in the group that didn't exist, and that included folks like Sergey Brin, Sebastian Thrun, the best probabilistic roboticist in the world, for my money. Not that anybody bets on that. Babak Parviz, Astro Teller. These are people that I call nerd famous. Like if you're a super nerd, you're like, yes! And if you're not, you're like, that's a bunch of people's names. And for whatever reason, I'm in the room too, and we sit down on my first day of work, and this is near the beginning of Google X, so self-driving car doesn't exist yet, Glass doesn't exist yet, Loon doesn't exist yet, that sort of thing. We have this single sheet of paper, and it comes from Larry and Sergey, the founders of Google. And if anybody has gotten a project spec before, you're used to like kind of a big document. This is a single page. It's only 8 sentences long. It covers a third of the page. And the very first sentence in that piece of paper said, imagine that Google was in your brain. Now, this is my first meeting on my first day of work, and I'm reading that, the first sentence on the first page, and I was like, whew, that's a terrible idea. But luckily, there were 7 more sentences, and basically the 7 more sentences said something like this. Well, right now, Google is kind of a web service that you access through a browser, and you need to bring that browser up in your device, and usually to get onto your device, you need to log in or unlock your phone, that kind of thing. So it means that between the time that you have an idea for something you want to know and being able to use Google to go and get the answer to that thing that you want to know, you got these 4 or 5 steps in the way. So what we kind of imagine is that there'll be some point in the future that as soon as somebody thinks that they want to know something, they just instantly know it. So that's the 7 sentences, and the last sentence says, realize this in less than 5 years. Done. So luckily, we had a good long meeting. We had a 90-minute meeting to kick this off. And I was like, oh, it's plenty of time. And we jump right into the topic, and it's in that meeting that we start talking about, hey, what if we could build a heads-up display? What if we could build, that would allow you to, at least get on the trajectory toward being able to know things as soon as you want to know them without having to pull a device out. What if we built a contact lens? Well, then you don't need to pull anything out at all. Actually, you don't need to wear anything visible because the contact lens, I don't know, it'd just be in your eye, so it's kind of invisible. What if we improved voice assistance technology, AI, such that we were able to go process queries in a lot of other ways other than just typing them in? All these things would get us on trajectory to a world where you could instantly know things just by as soon as you wanted to know them. And this was basically the first half of the meeting, and I thought the first half of the meeting was one of the best meetings I had ever experienced in my life, because right before I was at Google, I was at Yahoo as an executive helping to run a multi-billion-dollar business in 44 countries. And it sounds kind of impressive, but my entire life was just meetings and politics. So many meetings, I made a new unit of measure, which I called meetings per linear foot. Because I had like meetings blocked back to back all day, and even when I was walking between meetings, like people would run up trying to get my approval on a thing. I was like, oh no, I had 3 meetings in the 800 feet between these 2 meetings. So I was exhausted. As a person who comes from a formal training in engineering and design, like that's the sort of life that will destroy your soul. So just to talk about things all the time and never build things and have it all be very political. So when I got to Google and I was in this meeting on my first day of work, I was like, this is a breath of fresh air. We are talking about making this stuff. There's equations that are appearing on the board. These are my people. And that was the first half. That was the first 45 minutes of the 90-minute meeting. But right around the midpoint, it turned from being the best meeting of my life to one of the worst meetings of my life, because we spent the next 45 minutes just arguing about what color the heads-up display was going to be. And not the paint job, but like the photons that would go through the device. And it sounds kind of trivial, but it's not completely engineering trivial, because different colors of light have different indices of refraction, which means you design your optics slightly differently. You need a different light engine to go power it, a bunch of things. So it wasn't completely stupid, but what was stupid was the way we were debating stuff. I was instantly transported back to Yahoo, where we would have these meetings that I would label guessathons. Everybody was just guessing. They're like, I think it's got to be this color. Well, it's got to be this color. Well, I think it has to be this color. And everybody would just guess at each other. And the way that guessathons get handled is either the person that is best at arguing or the person with the highest title in the room ends up deciding. And that, meeting after meeting was extremely exhausting. So here I was. We went from one of the best meetings of my life in the first half to one of the worst. And by the end of that meeting, the normal guessathon thing happened. Remember, the person who's best at arguing or the person with the highest title in the room, on that particular day, it was the same human being, Sergey Brin. And he basically told us, hey, we talked about this for 45 minutes. That's enough. I've made the decision. The color in the heads-up display is going to have to be red. It has to be red for 2 important reasons. Number 1, red photons are the least energetic. They're going to impart the least energy onto your retina. And given that we're trying to make something that's comfortable enough to wear all day, has to be red. Least energy, most comfortable, wear all day, has to be red. Reason number 2, it's always red in science fiction. Now, everybody in the room, their boss is Sergey, and I think they're sitting there nodding, and it's all good. But I had just come from this corporate environment in Yahoo, and I was like, no, this is how we made decisions in Yahoo, and look at how that turned out. And I remember, even as I was walking out the door of that meeting, I was like, no. This is my first day of work. We're at the beginning of an entirely new group. It's not like we have all this ingrained bureaucracy. There's no reason that we need to work like this. Like, we can make this work any way that we want. We're just starting, we're not going to do that. And by the time I had walked out the door, I vowed, well, what can we do instead? What we're going to do is we're just going to build the heads-up display. We have all these great, engineers, physicists, designers in the room. We're just going to build it. We're going to answer the question based on what we've built. So for anybody that doesn't know the answer to this, how long do you think it took to make the first working version of the device so that you could go answer the question from that morning? You can say something now. Okay, good. This is good. You guys are good. So the answer is later that day. And this is the second one. It's not the first one. The first one was done before lunch. This is made slightly after lunch. And basically what it is there's a coat hanger that rests behind the neck. Actually, right behind it, you can see my welcome balloons. Anyway. There's a coat hanger that hangs behind the neck. The other end of the coat hanger is bent in a spiral. It holds up a clear piece of plexiglass so you can easily see through that. And at the end of the piece of plexiglass, there's a sheet protector, which is a material that's really easy to see through, but if you project an image onto the material, also holds the image really clearly. And at the base of the plexiglass, there's a pico projector. So basically anything that you can put onto a little netbook, a little computer, you can basically have floating in front of you as you walk around and interact with it. And there he's wearing a glove that he can also interact with it, but that's a separate thing. So very first thing, given the guess-a-thon in the morning, was let's go type out several paragraphs of text, put them in every color of the rainbow, and make it so that we can just try to read in this color, and then flip to the next color, try to read in this color, flip to the next color. And once this prototype was built, I brought the people from the meeting over to experience it, and one by one they put it on. And remember, these are the same human beings that argued about this for 45 minutes and finally, through the guess-a-thon process, decided that red was going to be the color. Within 90 seconds, it didn't take them more than 90 seconds. It only takes you about 10 seconds to read a paragraph, and then you flip to the next color, 10 seconds to read a paragraph, you flip to the next color. Within 90 seconds, every single person that tried this agreed that red was the absolute worst color for heads-up display. And it was not just the worst, it was the worst by an enormous margin. And after red, purple was the second worst, much better, and the best ones were light blue, white, and yellow. Now, and total agreement across all the people that used this. And ironically, it turns out that red is the absolute worst color for exactly the reason that Sergey said it would be the best color. Red photons are, in fact, the least energetic. They do impart the least energy on your retina, and it means that when you're walking around in a lit environment, every other color of photon outcompetes red. If you're using night vision goggles, absolutely, red is fine. There's not that many competing photons. In every other environment in the world, walking in an office, being outside, anywhere in the world, red is the absolute worst color to be able to read in. Now, I bet, though, when I shared those two reasons that Sergey gave to end the guess-a-thon, at least that first one sounded a little smarter, right? Like, there's not that many dumb people that can use the word photon and retina in a sentence that is true to physics, because all that is true. And if you took away nothing else from this talk, this would be a great thing to take away, which is that smart people will always come up with smart reasons for their guesses. But it does not mean that their guesses are not guesses. And what we spend most of our time at work doing is sitting across from people and trying to evaluate whether what they're saying sounds smart or dumb or something in between, whether we agree or we don't. And I'm just going to tell you that the 90% of the cognition that you spend at work doing that process is wasted cognition. Because it actually doesn't matter how much you agree or disagree, if it sounds smart or it doesn't sound smart. The only thing to listen for is when I hear something, is it a guess or is it a direct experience? If it's a guess, it needs to be treated a certain way. And it's not problematic. There's great things that you can do with guesses. But if it's a direct experience, then that's the stuff we want to make decisions off of. When everybody has the direct experience of all the colors and we know that red is the hardest one to read when rendered as text, it's easy to make that decision. Right? Because the direct experience drives very clean decisions. In the absence of the direct experience, you can have all the same people, you can have really smart people on your team, you can even have a great working dynamic, but if the material that you're working with is guesses, not only can you be wrong, you can be wildly off, and you can be certain about the status of the rightness of your thing which is wildly off. Right? So think about the material of cognition. Is the material of cognition that is coming in guesses, or the material of cognition that you're working with direct experiences? And the reason that we have the sprint process, the reason that the sprint process is so essential is we start in a world where most people are working in the medium of guesses, right? And the sprint process says, well, let's all get together and at least be having the same sort of conversation. And at the end of the sprint process, let's start making some prototypes so that direct experiences can start happening. And in that process, you guys kind of go through that transition from working with a very poor material, just arguing about each other's guesses, to working with a highly enriched quality material, which is direct experience. And this is my mantra for this. Oh, I forgot to say one thing. If you tell a smart person that they're guessing, they would tend to be offended. If you tell them that they have a conjecture, they're like, oh yeah, I have a great conjecture. Now, of course, they mean the same thing, but and I said this before, but this is the mantra. This is the way to go parse this out. When you are sitting across from that person and you're hearing, is this a guess or is this a direct experience, like an actual experience that they've had? Well, if it is a guess or a conjecture, it doesn't mean that you need to be like, hey, well, that's just a guess or that's just a conjecture. That's not that productive. But what you do in your mind is you pose the question to yourself, well, that's a really interesting conjecture. How could that become an experiment? What's the thing that we could try that would allow us to have a direct experience? In the process of moving a conjecture to an experiment, we allow for a direct actual experience to happen. Now, once we do those experiments, we will have a lot of actual experiences. And I just call them actuals for short. And actuals are great for driving decisions. if nobody can read the color red, it's really, really easy to decide that the color red is not the color for the text in that system. All right, I got to go fast because there's a bunch of things to cover. So that's the thing from Google. I also work with a bunch of organizations, like helping them speed up their rate of innovation or work on really difficult technical, innovative projects. But in this case, I got called in at the last minute. It was actually my birthday, too. It was a weird day. But I got called in the last minute to work with this company, Schneider Electric. And they're like a big electrical utility provider in Europe and internationally, not as big in the US. But just to give you a sense, they made $23 billion top-line revenue in the year that I was working with them. So yeah, they know how to make some money. But they came to me, and they basically said, because remember, I usually work on how to make companies more innovative or work on like, oh, how do I bring artificial intelligence to this new area, like a really difficult technical problem. They came to me and they're like, Tom, we got something really difficult for you. It's an HR problem. I was like, oh, did you read my bio? Because I like make self-driving cars and stuff. But okay, HR problem, what is the HR problem? And they basically described, some of the background to me, but it came out to something like they were losing 70% of their top executives every 3 years. And I was like, whoa, that is not a little HR retention problem. That sounds like a Geneva Convention problem. And I was like, well, what's happening? And they basically gave me the background. There's two things that they were organizationally very proud of, that when you add them together, it led to them losing all these top executives. Number one is, like I said, they're in all these countries, but instead of like working as one big centralized org, they broke it all up so that all the different countries are basically their own org, their own P&L. And that P&L has got a CEO at the top of it that gets to make those local decisions. And the benefit of that business-wise is great. They're able to make these very nimble decisions so that they can gain market share in that specific country, and it was working for them. So great. Now the other thing was that, if you guys have ever, spent any time around executives, there's this thing called succession planning, which is, hey, if you get hit by a bus or like you need to leave the org, you need to have other quality people that can come in and be the next executives after you. But not only were they fans of succession planning, they noticed that innovation-wise, when a person first gets into the role, they make a lot of changes in the first couple years. But by year 3 or 4, they've basically gotten done, the agenda they were going to get done in terms of the big changes, and then it's a little bit more steady state. So they thought to themselves, well, let's take succession planning to the next level. Let's have it so that, even as you're 2 years in, you begin thinking about who your successor is, and you start looking at the candidates, and by the 3 to 4 year mark, you select a new CEO that's going to replace you, and then you kind of usher them in. And they did that, and they got what they wanted. They got a second boost in innovation, because that next person, even if they were selected by the previous CEO, was excited, went hard at it. But when you add those two things together, it led to them losing all their top executives, because let's say you know that a new CEO is going to get selected in 6 months or 12 months, and you're one of the top people in the org, and you want to be the CEO. Well, you're not the only one. There's like 4 or 5 other people at your level of skill, but the CEO can only choose one of them. And when the CEO does choose one of them, suddenly you're reporting to somebody that used to be your peer. So if you had a weird relationship with them, you probably want to leave. But even if you didn't, and you were an ambitious person, by them being promoted, it basically tells you immediately that you could not get that promotion for the next 3 to 4 years until the next succession cycle comes through. So a lot of ambitious people left anyhow. So with all this, I was like, shoot, you guys kind of understand the problem pretty well. What's happened? And that's when they trotted out all the slides, so many slides. And they walked me through like 5 different proposals, 5 different retention proposals for like an hour. And even though for confidentiality reasons, these are not the actual slides, there was definitely a bow tie in there, and there's definitely a circle and a circle, and there's definitely a 3-dimensional pyramid for some reason. And at the end of listening to this for over an hour, and I'm charging for the whole thing by the hour, I was like, shoot, okay, fine. I was like, yeah, so it seems like you worked on it pretty hard. So what happened when you tried these out? And they're like, oh, we didn't try these out yet. I was like, okay, it's a lot of work to not try. Did you just invent, did you just come up with these? Did you just not have time to do it yet? They're like, oh no, these 5 proposals, the oldest one's like 22 months old, and the youngest one is like 10 months old. And I was like, uh-oh. Well, how could you know about the problem for a long time, have all these potential solutions that you've thought through, and then have years go by without trying it? And then their tone got super serious. They're like, Tom, I don't think you understand. This is really serious business. If we execute the wrong retention program, we might lose our top executives. And I'm doing the math on losing 70% every 3 years. I was like, uh-oh, you're losing them right now. So I basically told them, you know what? The way that you actually get things done is you need to move out of idea space. Things need to happen in real time and space. If any of these colorful polygons mean anything, it's because something in the real world is going to change. So let's just zoom into that moment where it would change, and let's make it happen right now. And of course, they're still staring at me, but I was like, whatever. We're just going to do it right now. So this is a room of all the CEOs of all the countries in Schneider. And I was like, pick your favorite proposal. And they had one. Their favorite proposal was something like you guys know what a student exchange program is. It's kind of like an executive exchange program. Like, let's say you're one of these top executives, you didn't get the CEO role, but you're great. You were the COO of Brazil, you were great at it, but they have all these operations issues in Egypt. Well, what you do is you do the executive exchange program, you pop over to Egypt, you solve a bunch of their problems for a couple of years, you come back a hero, Schneider is healthier, you're excited because your career is better, blah, blah, blah. But I was like, cool, well, if that's your favorite program, we're gonna make it happen right now. And I just pointed to somebody in the crowd, I was like, who are you? And they're like, oh, I'm the CEO of Brazil. I was like, come over here. And he came over here, and I pulled a chair around, sat him in the chair, and I was like, okay, you're the CEO of Brazil. And I pulled the table over, and this is the desk in your office. And he's like, okay. And I was like, who are you? And the person stood up. He's the CEO of a different place in Schneider. And I was like, come over. And when he walked over, I was like, okay, for the purpose of this exercise, you're the COO of Brazil, and you're coming into this office to find out whether you got the promotion or not. And just act like this is actually happening to you. And luckily, these guys are all the CEOs. They've been in this position before. They walked into this office at some point and got told they got it. So they remember this situation. So I was like, just pretend like this is actually happening to you. I'm going to have you knock on the door and make this happen. And I leaned over the CEO of Brazil and I said, well, what's going to happen is he's not going to get the job, but you're going to tell him about this amazing executive exchange program. Cool. So knocks on the door, opens it, they shake hands, they both sit down. And the CEO of Brazil begins talking. He's like, I know you've been super eager to find out the results of our new CEO selection process, and I want to let it be known that you are absolutely one of the most talented and valuable members of our team. If you ever hear this, very bad news is coming. And then he's like, but I need to tell you that you didn't get the promotion, but we have this amazing program. And he starts talking about the executive exchange program. Now remember, I told this person to pretend like this is actually happening to them. Imagine you're in that office again, you don't know whether you got it or not, and you're sitting down and somebody's saying these words to you. And like initially, his face is kind of neutral, he's just nodding. And then there's like some concern on the face, like some furrowing of the brow. And then there's like some tension in the shoulders and back. And like within 2 minutes of him talking, he like pushes back from the table, stands up, and he's like, that's enough, I've heard enough. Look, I've been a professional for over 20 years. I've been an executive for over 12 years. I understand sometimes you get the promotion, sometimes you don't. I didn't get the promotion, that's fine, no issue. But now what you're telling me is in order to continue to have a great career at Schneider, I need to pull my kids out of school, convince my wife to move to a country we don't even speak the language, work with a team I've never even met once, and abandon the team that, to your credit, is one of the best operational teams in all of Schneider. You are crazy, I quit. Now remember, this is their favorite retention program. Like 2 minutes into their favorite retention program, they lose the person. It's because a lot of times we're working in this type of currency, right? Symbolic currency, just filled with conjectures, filled with guesses. It doesn't land as anything real. So part of why we do sketches in the sprint process, part of the reason that we move toward prototyping toward the end of the sprint process is we take these things that are kind of floaty, guessy type things and we concretize them so they can be directly experienced. When it becomes a sketch, I can directly experience it. When it becomes a prototype and I can sit in that room or sit in front of that mobile, the mobile app screens or interact with a person in a phone meeting, it becomes something that can be directly experienced. And in that process of directly experiencing it, then we can very, very quickly go sort out issues. And you see how many people are in the room, right? And there was 5 of these proposals. So I basically just, after demoing that for people, I broke them up into a lot of little subgroups, and each subgroup had one of those 5 proposals to go prototype. And within 30 minutes, every single one of the 5 proposals had been tried, half a dozen times, because there's enough people in the room to try this pretty fast. And at the end of 30 minutes, people had quit in every proposal. Now, not in every room of every proposal, but the quit rate was very, very high. So understandably, I'll just throw this in because this is important. They were kind of down after all of that, right? It's like you're workshopping and you expect to have all this excitement afterwards, but every single one of the things, every proposal made people quit. Even if you succeeded in not quitting in your room, right next to you, somebody quit using that same proposal. And they were kind of like, ugh. And as a facilitator, it's like, how was that, everybody? And they're like, I don't know. Can it never happen again? And I was like, okay. Okay, it seems like it didn't go the way that you wanted, but was there any energy in the room? Was there any energy that was coming back from the, the person you were testing with? And these people, Schneider is a European-based company, so, they looked at me and was like, energy, is this some California thing? I was like, no. I'm talking about something very specific. If you see somebody and they're just having an average whatever day and they're kind of neutral energy, you know what that looks like, right? They're like, oh, it's having a normal day, no problem. And you can see how different, and I'll call that zero energy. And you can see how different that would be than a day where they have really positive energy and they're really enthusiastic, engaged, and they're excited, right? You can tell that difference, right? And oh, sure. So I was like, okay, so if this is zero, then this is a lot of energy, but it's positive. And you can see how this might be also different than a lot of negative energy, because negative energy would be I'm frustrated, I'm upset, I feel like I'm not being heard, that sort of thing. You can tell the difference between that and neutral too, right? And they're like, yeah. So if this is zero, then this is a lot of energy, positive, this is a lot of energy, negative. So with that definition, was there any energy in the room? And then they were like, oh yeah, then there was a lot of energy, a lot of negative energy. And I said, cool. That means you are this close to the breakthrough, right? Because nobody changes their behavior for a neutral outcome, right? Let's say you were a big fan of WhatsApp, and then one day your friend comes to you and is like, oh, I got this new messaging app. You have to install it. It does exactly the same things as WhatsApp. You'd be like, what's wrong with you, right? Because who would change their behavior to get exactly the same outcome? And this is really important because when we do these design sprints, when we're trying to go advance our product, a lot of times we think, well, we put something in front of the user and they were able to get to the end, they successfully completed the task, this is good. But no, that's not what that means you're not close. If you have neutral energy and they successfully complete the task, you basically end up with that situation where I built this sophisticated thing which is equally good to WhatsApp, nobody wants to use it. Right? What's way more important than whether they got to the end of the prototypes or whether the sketches were voted upon and agreed upon by all the people as the greatest sketch in the world is actually when a customer experiences it, does energy come out and does the energy get satisfied in an interesting way? So actually having a lot of positive energy or a lot of negative energy means you're much closer to the innovative breakthrough. And here's the reason. If you have a lot of positive, because you'd say, well, positive is very different than negative. No, actually, they're the same. Because the reason is the following. If you have a lot of positive energy, what it means more fundamentally is that there is something that you really, really care about, and you are perceiving that that thing that you care about is improving, or the options are getting wider, or you're making progress on it, right? And then if you have a lot of negative energy, then actually, once again, at the core, it means that there's something you really care about is being exposed. But in this case, you feel like it's threatened or diminished, or the options are being reduced. But in either case, by seeing that energy come forward, it means that you've discovered something that they really care about. Now, that may happen, but we never even ask about it. So given that they were still sitting across from these people that were so disappointed in the proposals, I basically said, great. Recall a moment in the running of the prototype where you felt like there's a lot of negative energy, and then just ask the person, what was it that you really cared about, that you felt was at threat? What was it that you really cared about that made you so upset in that moment? And this is a workshop moment, so they had a couple minutes to go talk with folks, and they shared back the answers. And it turned out that the things that these executives cared about that made them upset were all the same things. It was 2 or 3 things, and it was things like, oh, I want to feel like I can continue to have a really productive and exciting and creative career at Schneider. Number 2, I want to do right by my team. I've spent all this time investing in my team. I want to do right by my team. Whatever I do next, I want to do right by my team. And it's like those are the things that they really cared about. And even though they did all these different iterations, they had all these sad points and different prototypes, the underlying things that actually people cared about were the same across all these people. And I said, well, now that you've figured out what that is, I want you to throw away all these prototype sketches, and I want you to just do something that addresses one or two of the things that they deeply care about. And they did so, and they iterated for about 45 minutes, and then after that much time, they found a program that got everybody excited to stay at Schneider. All right, I'm not going to tell you until we get to the end because we may not have enough time to go do it, but I will tell you that it worked very well. Now, why did we do it like this? Here's the way to explain why to go do this type of methodology. Imagine there's a game, and all of you guys have a single 6-sided dice, and you can choose the dice. There's no, cheaty dice in here. And the game works like this. Everybody in the room gets to roll their dice exactly once, and if it comes up a 6, you win, and I pay you $1 million. It's a pretty good game so far. Nice. Here's the rest of the rules. If it comes up anything but a 6, then you lose and you pay me $1 million. Okay, now people don't like this game anymore. And actually, if you were forced to play this game, you'd be stressing, right? You'd be like, oh my gosh, we might win $1 million, but we're probably going to lose $1 million, probably going to lose $1 million. And unwittingly, this is the game that we're playing all the time when we're trying to do new and interesting things in an organization. Because really, what the dice you're about to roll will probably cost $1 million. Because let's say you put 4 or 5 staff on it, and they're on it for 6 months. Well, think about the salary cost. Think about the opportunity cost. You add up the actual numbers, it is like $1 million bet. And if you roll it wrong, boop, we've lost $1 million. If it probably won't work, we're probably going to lose $1 million. And this is why people stress so much about these types of changes. That's the game they're playing, the first game. Now we're going to improve this game. The update to this game is instead of getting to roll once, you now get to roll 20 times. And if it ever comes up a 6, you win $1 million. If it never comes up a 6 in 20 rolls, you lose, and you pay me $1 million. Now that's already a better game, right? And people are like, I'll play this game. And actually that game, you're like, oh, let's start rolling. I'm probably going to win $1 million. And then you don't worry at all until it's roll 17, and you haven't rolled 6 yet. And you're like, oh, there's only 3 rolls left. Well, are we going to make it? So, okay, game 2 is a big improvement because you're not afraid of starting anymore. Now let's talk about game 3. Same rolls, but now you get to roll 100 times. Well, you're just going to win $1 million. Right? In fact, you don't even need to stress about that much. You can run that experiment thousands of times. You'll win $1 million every time. Right? Like the likelihood that you will not roll a 6 in 100 is so close to 0 that it's basically 0. For all practical purposes in business and life, it's 0. And what I encourage teams to do, and the sprint process definitely helps you get into that space, is move from playing game 1 to playing game 3. Right? In game 1, you're scared to even roll. You're scared to even give it a try. In game 3, it's like, we're rolling, and we were definitely going to win because it's 100. Now, remember, I mentioned at the very beginning, we did 100 prototypes of Project Loon in 4 months with 5 people. And you're like, wow, it's so random. It ended up on such a round number after that month. So it's like, no, that was the actual goal. Because the way that we do it is we basically defined what we were going to do as a rate of experimentation, and we said there's a prototype number that if we hit, we will have near perfect certainty that we would have found an outcome that is interesting. Even if that outcome says, let's not do the project, that's fine. That's near perfect certainty. And for us, it was 100 prototypes. After 100 prototypes of Project Loon, we would know with near perfect certainty whether this is completely uninteresting and Google should do no more on it, or whether this is interesting and maybe we can make some awesome progress and we should fund it more. And you want to divide that by the available time. In this case, we gave ourselves 4 months to go do it because it seemed like a reasonable amount of time to do that type of experiment. And then it gives you your rate goal. So 100 prototypes over 4 months is 25 prototypes per month. We had 5 people on team. So it was roughly 1 prototype per person per week over the course of those 4 months. And doing that, it was actually very straightforward to play game 3. Right? Game 3 is not some complicated, witchcraft to be able to go do. You just decide, at 100, we're going to know the answer for sure. And how much time do we need to know the answer within? Well, now we know the rate, and now we know our staff, and it tells you how long you have for each experiment. And of course, if it gets so small where it's like 3 minutes for each experiment, then that's a little too tight. But like, one person doing one experiment per week seemed totally reasonable, and we basically made that the goal. And at the end of each week, we said, how's your experiment this week? How's your experiment this week? How's your experiment this week? If 2 people wanted to team up, they'd need to team up and do 2 experiments together, right? It's relatively easy management. But at the end of that, we were able to get to near perfect certainty, and for $70,000 of prototyping materials, we get to near perfect certainty. And all that's happening there is we're playing a game where we make the dice roll so cheap that by the end of 100 dice rolls, we had only spent $70,000 of prototyping materials. Then it was easy to say, let's go spend more money on this project, let's go do more. And this is the sort of world that can open up as you guys are able to do more sprints, get people into this mindset, get into faster experimentation, and it depends on how close you are to the leadership. In this particular case, I was the boss of this org, so it was just like, oh, I've convinced the leadership, because I was like, it's me. And I was like, this is how we're going to do it. So that was a very easy convince. But if you are not the actual boss of the org, then you basically can, within the scope of the world that you contain, like maybe you're a designer, and there's a certain number of prototypes you're going to go hold yourself to. You say, well, yeah, I'm the designer, I'll do 3 per week. And I know that by the time I do 20, doing 3 per week, I'm going to be near perfectly confident that I've done what I can on this, right? So even if you're an individual contributor, you can use this sort of skill. But as you do that, it actually becomes easier and easier to go convince folks higher up in the organization to come along. Okay, we're going to do one more thing and then close this out. So yes. So every organization has got a thing that's called a learning loop, and this is a Fast Company. Were we in Forbes or Fast Company? I don't know. I think it's Fast Company. Yeah, Fast Company article about some work I did with this company that does like a 1-for-1 model for social good. They basically sell a water filter, and if you buy their filter plan, then it also gives water to somebody in the developing world. Separate thing. But they came to me and they basically said, hey, we did version 1.0 of our device, and it really took like 15 months to make. And we heard that you're really fast at prototyping and teaching organizations to be faster. How can we be faster? Could we do it in 5 months? And I was like, we could do better than that. And I basically, before we get there, I was like, tell me a little bit about how people end up buying your product. And he kind of walked through. There were some direct online sales, but more than 70% of their sales were coming through retail chains like Target. And I was like, okay, well, tell me what happens in Target then. It's like, well, a person's, rolling through the aisle, and they'll walk by the Brita filters and Pure filters, and they're in the market for a water filter, and we'll be there as well. And they might pick up a couple boxes and look at the sides, and they'll look at ours, and if our thing is compelling, they'll put it in their cart and keep on rolling. And I was like, how long does that take? Like, you've seen this happen, right? And he's like, yeah. It's like 30 seconds. People don't sit there and spend 10 minutes deliberating what water filter to get. And I was like, okay, then I have a way to go prototype the new one that you're trying to go create. And the way that we did it is we basically analyzed, because there is something called a learning loop, which dictates the speed at which you can go learn about your current product or a new product. And it basically involves 4 different pieces, which is how fast can you build a new variation, which is different than what you're trying today? How fast can you test it with customers? How fast can you observe the actuals that come from customer interaction? And then how quickly can you adjust from those actuals? Because sometimes you do a test, you write a report, you send it to the executives, they don't read it, nothing actually adjusts. So you can even do all the great stuff, and then it doesn't connect. So you need that so that the loop can close, you can keep going. And we quickly analyzed their 15-month version of it, and everything was super slow. This was super slow, and they were very nervous about this. And once they got the actuals, people didn't even look at the actuals very clearly because they had so many opinions about how the customer should have responded, blah, blah, blah. So kind of normal stuff. But I said, well, we're going to do this one differently. And what we did is I basically brought the designers and a product person all in a room, and this was called the home team room. And we all put together a first version of what would appear on the side of the box. Like if you were to pick up the box at Target, what would people see on the side of the box? This is the thing that they're interacting with for 30 seconds before they put it in the cart or not, right? And so we just basically mocked up the design of the side of the box, blah. And that's the home team. And then we had 5 away teams, and the away teams were 2 people each, and each one of them had a tablet. And on the tablet, it basically had, the side of the box, and you could swipe and see the rest of the stuff on the side of the box, right? Easy stuff. And then they also had a version of the current water filter with them, so they could show, oh, we're the company that makes this. Here's a new product that we're making. So we sent the 5 away teams to places where that had consumers similar to the consumers that bought this product, which were like Whole Foods, Apple Store, those sorts of places. So 5 away teams, and luckily we have a bunch of Whole Foods and Apple stores in this city. So we sent the 5 away teams to those places. And as people were walking out of the store, they're like, hey, do you have a minute? I'd love to show you this thing. And they would begin to give this feedback. And because we had 5 away teams and it took about 10 minutes on average for them to go talk to a person, it meant that on average we were getting new feedback about the thing every 2 minutes. And the feedback wasn't going into the ether. A lot of times we were putting the home team on speakerphone, or somebody that was in the away group was actually texting the home team all throughout the session so that we were getting the input. And we all had it on a group messaging thing. It was like bloop, 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 or over speakerphone, and we were hearing it. And remember, the designers and product people are in this room. So we start modifying it super quick. Oh, they don't understand this. That's on the side of the box. Okay. Oh, this call out means nothing to them. Oh, it's getting a little too messy over here. Can you make a version with fewer things? And we edit. And that would happen over the course of about 30 minutes. And remember, if we're getting feedback on average every 2 minutes, that means 30 minutes of integrating is about 15 pieces of feedback that we've done. And by the end of that 30 minutes, we sent one word to the group text which said refresh. And everybody out in the field was like, bloop, 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 bloop. All the images changed, and then they kept going. And we went from, in the first version, people were like, what is this product? I don't know if I need this. Like, I was happy to give you some answers, but I don't want it. To like the middle where they're like, well, this is pretty desirable. Like, when is this going to be available? To the end where we actually had to go make a PayPal page to accept pre-orders. Because people were like, I want to be the first to get this. And that happened just over the course of about 3.5 hours. Now, all that was happening here is we were optimizing the heck out of the learning loop, because building a new variation was happening. We're hearing this feedback, and we're making these adjustments to the text, the design, to the layout, right? Testing it with customers, that was happening every 2 minutes on average, right? Being able to observe the actuals, it was basically real time because it was coming over speakerphone, or it was like immediately texted right after the person said it. And then the adjustment, like I said, was happening at, shortly after we heard them. And instead of having a 15-month learning loop, we brought it down to, 30 minutes roughly, depending on how you want to count it, 5 minutes. And in that process, you cannot help. Think about how easy it is to play game 3 if rolling a dice takes you 5 minutes, right? Well, then rolling a dice 100 times doesn't take you very long. And by the end of the day, you're selling your product. And this is what I mean by like getting to near perfect certainty in a short amount of time. You can design this stuff into this by optimizing your learning loop, by focusing on things like this. And this is like a classic kind of exercise I do with organizations. Like, we diagram their current loop and all the guessathons and conjectures that they have and the time when they're actually building and testing and da-da-da. And it might be 18 weeks long. We remove like a lot of the conjecture stuff. We improve their tool chain so they're able to do it faster. And this is going to be a whirlwind tour because we need to get to the end. I need to be done soon. Because I'm not over yet. I'm very close to it. But this is like a normal work week for a lot of teams that I would run. Blue is all the areas where you can actually do your work, your design work, your coding work, that sort of thing. But you'll notice on Tuesday and Thursday, there was 3 hours each to be in front of customers. And people hear this and they're like, that's crazy. I have such a busy week. Where the hell does 6 hours come from to be with customers? And I was like, that 6 hours saves us 15 hours of arguing. Because what would normally happen is like, I think this, well, I think that. And then the whole meeting goes, like a whole hour goes, and you didn't decide anything. But when you have this sort of format, there's either a test later today or there is a test tomorrow. That is one feature of this schedule. And what it meant is all the conversations where people started arguing, we could resolve it very simply, which is like, could you prep it for the test tomorrow? And they're like, sure. I was like, could you prep yours for the test tomorrow? It's like, sure. Well, let's use the rest of the meeting to prep our tests. And then we would just do them, and then we would do it, right? So like all the stuff that expands into these conjectural arguments, these guessathons, whoop, you save those 15 hours. We actually would end some of the weeks like, what do we do now? It's like, well, let's just go back out and get some beers. Now, and this is actually what it looked like. Remember, in the 3 hours, we would just take we'd take an Uber, and we'd throw the dev team and some designers into the Uber, and we would Uber over to the mall Because the mall has if you do consumer stuff, if you have a B2B thing, I would have a separate thing to go talk to you about, but it's fine. Like if you have B2C stuff, the nice thing about the mall is every type of person is in the mall and they're broken up by demographic based on store. So if you want to go meet, women over 40, then there's like Ann Taylor. And if you want to go meet, like teenagers, then there's Hot Topic, whatever. There's like a store that has that type of demographic streaming out of it. So whoever you're trying to reach, there are like places in the mall that you can just go stand and this will work fine. And in this case, this is one of our developers, and here's two people that we met in the food court, and they're basically using the product right there. And we use this so that the user, recruiting is very straightforward and fast. And what we're looking for is not just task complete, because I think a lot of times people go in there and their target is usability, which is I put something together, people generally understood it, they got to the end of the flow, they didn't dislike it, we're good. And I was like, no, remember, like if you replaced WhatsApp with a totally perfectly functioning but exactly the same WhatsApp, nobody's on it, right? So like usability and task complete is not the bar. The bar needs to be their eyes light up. There's a moment in the process that when they're using it, they're like amazed, they're excited that the thing can do something like this. Because that's you, once again, when the eyes are lighting up, you're addressing that energy. So remember neutral versus positive versus negative energy. When their eyes are lighting up, it's because you've addressed that energy. You've taken something that they really cared about and you've given them, it's really working for them, really excited about that. Or you took something that they're really concerned about and scared about and you've alleviated that concern. Those things will make people's eyes light up. And that's actually what we're looking for. The reason that we do all these iterations is not to get to just some usability task complete. It's because we want to do enough, have a high enough prototype number that we find that magic moment. And once you go find that magic moment, everything becomes simpler, right? The reason that we do like this fast, adaptable sketching, prototyping, that it enables us finding the magic expediently. And another common thing, remember conjectures versus actuals, another common mixing that really messes up teams is they start talking about scalability before you find any magic. Right, what's the point of having something that's usable, that people get to the end of the task every time and scaling it out to 100 million people when it provides no magic in their life, when it's just like the version of WhatsApp that does all the same things, right? You can have it reach everybody. It's like, oh, these servers are ready for infinite scale, and then 10 people show up. Like, okay, well, the difficulty here too is when you start talking about scalability really early, it actually actively impedes the finding of magic. Because you just say, well, this is close enough. People seem to get to the end of the task. That's what we'll ship. And it's like, well, that's not how you make things that are really powerful in their lives. That's not how you make things that are memorable. And the way that I summarize this is, if this is the timeline of experience with a particular product, your product is really the magic moment. And there's really only two types of features once you've discovered your magic moment. There's features that get you to the magic moment faster and amplify the magic moment when it happens. And there's features that don't. And anything that doesn't get you to the magic moment faster or amplify the magic moment when it happens, you should cut. Even though you feel like, oh, it's more functionality and like people might enjoy this functionality, this is the way that you make terrible products, basically. Because like actually what it is doing, it is detracting and delaying the point where they actually experience that magic. Right? Even though I added more, maybe I got my, my bonus for shipping. These are things that actually make products worse generation after generation. Like, I don't know, who thinks that iOS 12 is like way better than iOS 6, right? It's like, there was some point where it's like, this is not magic that's getting added now. This is just stuff. Like, and you feel it. Anyway, it's no problem. So, is there time for questions? Or okay, so I'm going to end then, and we're going to take just a couple questions. If you need to reach me, this is my social media thing. And also, my online course is starting next week, which is like a 6-week deep dive into applying this type of stuff to your work. Okay, awesome. Any questions? In the back.
Hi. Okay, I'm curious, you were talking about the usage metaphor rolling the dice and how you want to roll about 100 times. Do you evolve the questions that you're asking yourself and what you're testing as you're iterating and learning more for each of those failures?
Yeah, absolutely. So you don't already predefine what all 100 experiments will be. You just say, well, hey, we're going to do 100, so we know the rate, which is 1 experiment per week per person. And there's 5 of us, so there's 5 this week. So what's your 5 this week? And then next week we would have learned some stuff and we adjust. But we stay to the rate. So it's not totally wild because there is a rate that grounds you, but it's also not totally predetermined because how can you predict the outcome of 100 experiments? And just like a quick clarification, the reason we picked 100 is we were trying to build a global internet with balloons. That's something that's never been done before. If you're doing something that's a little easier, like making a web page, you might pick 20 or 10. That's actually probably fine for making a web page. So like, whatever it is, you pick the number where you have near perfect certainty that you would have looked at the options that you needed to look at. And maybe to make an informational web page, 15 is actually fine. Like, well, we looked in 15 different directions, we got that feedback, that's fine. So you can pick your prototype number to be anything. It's basically, if you were to look at the additional reward per number of prototype, there's a point where it asymptotes. And as that gets to be pretty horizontal, that's where your prototype number is. So for building a worldwide internet using balloons, it's about 100. And then for making a web page or something, it's probably 15. Yeah. Over here in the front.
What's the best way to evaluate the feedback that you're getting in the rapid prototype?
Right. So, okay, this is really good. And this is very important for effective sessions. A thing that we fall into all the time is like the guided tour. And the guided tour is like, oh, first you're going to get to this page, and you're going to notice this new thing that we have over here. So click that. Like, okay. Right? And if you do that, you're basically going to learn nothing. What you want to do instead is you just want to put them in a situation. It's like, hey, you saw so-and-so on the side of the bus. You typed in the URL, go. Right? And they're like, oh, I'm lost. And that's more real. Right? So you will get much better feedback if you just allow them to have the situation, including all the fails. And the guided tour, we do that because maybe we worked on these 7 screens here. We want to make sure they get to them. But it's actually way more important to make it realistic and find out that nobody gets to those 7 screens because they're totally confused about this language. Or your product really seems about this and not that. So they don't even think that such screens would exist. Like, that is actually way more real. Because remember the Schneider Electric example. They believed that was going to drive retention. Right? And they believed for a long time, years, they believed it was going to drive retention. When you put people in the real situation, though, it made people quit. So by being able to actually keep people fully situated and just watching what unfolds, then you're able to get the real stuff. And once they're in the pathway of the real stuff, when their eyes light up, it's unmistakable. And you're like, that is what we were looking for. We ran 50 experiments because we wanted to find that. And now that we found it, then great, let's go build a whole world around it. Actually, there was one slide that wasn't in there, but I'll just tell you about it. Like, you guys know Uber. And I remember the first time that I was using Uber, I was like, damn, this is amazing, this is amazing. I had to tell everybody about it. But actually, when you think about it, let's say your Uber ride is 25 minutes long. Almost every minute of that 25 minutes is exactly like being in a cab. The majority of it is like you're sitting in the back of a car and somebody's up front driving you somewhere. It's like, what the hell? But actually, Uber is really only 15 seconds different. There's 10 seconds at the beginning where you pull out your phone. Instead of being in the street like, hey, 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 you're like, bloop, pick me up. And then there's 5 seconds at the end. Instead of rustling with your wallet and being like, oh, you want 20%? Jeez, I mean, you just drove me somewhere, okay. Right? Arguing with the person about tip, you're like, yeah, thanks, and you just pop out the door. That 10 seconds plus that 5 seconds, that 15 seconds built a $50 billion company. Because both of those are magic moments, right? And every single employee at Uber has something to do with those 15 seconds. All the people that write that routing algorithm so it's more efficient, it's so that when you press this button, people show up at that first 10 seconds. All the people that are working on all the different payment systems and currencies and all that, so it's so that when it's time to leave, you're just like, hey, and you pop out the door, right? So once you find your magic moments, and it's typically not hours and hours, it's typically not even a minute long. Usually your magic moment really is a moment. It's like 5 seconds long, 10 seconds long. 30 seconds would be a very long magic moment. But once you find it, that is the main thing. Everything about how you're creating your organization and your product needs to be about that, right? If Uber went into the rest of it, it's like, well, the 23 minutes of the ride is sitting in this car. What if we start serving Uber mints? And it's like, no, this is not the thing. It's like, you don't have magical mints. Right? That's not the thing that I'm going to be like, hey, you gotta get it here because they got Altoids now. And you're like, no, that's not the reason that I'm going to get to the end of a thing and be like, you have to use this service. That's crazy town. So you keep on doing these experiments, these cheap experiments. And you guys are from the area. You probably know the original thing in Ubers. They didn't even have any cars. They just like rented a black car service for 10 weeks. And that was, the supply side of their marketplace. And the demand side, they made a really like lightweight web app that wasn't even a real app yet. But anyway, that was enough to be able for them to find the magic. And once they found the magic, they're like, let's build a whole big company around it. Okay, another question. Yes.
Started out talking about how your experience at Yahoo is just. You started out talking about how your experience at Yahoo is like meetings after meetings after meetings.
Oh, yes.
Can you talk about your top tip for changing that culture that enabled your teams to go after and build 100 prototypes versus sitting in meetings, telling executives why they should be doing this or justifying what their activities?
Oh, that's a great question. So here's because remember my DNA is as a engineer, scientist, designer. Like I have those different types of careers in my history, even coming up into Yahoo. And I was so frustrated by this meeting thing. I created a meeting on Thursday at 2 p.m. And the rules of the meeting were the following. Anybody can arrive, anybody can come to the meeting. There is no like fixed list. There's nobody that's excluded. But the only criteria is if you come, you need to have created something, recently that you want to go show everybody that's in the meeting. So only people that have created things. And they're like, oh, they need to be in your division? It's like, nope, just anybody. Now, like, I just started doing this with my own team, and it was like a super fun kind of Thursday thing. And because like creators were showing things to creators, and like, oh, that's so cool. I like, you did something super cool with that API. Maybe I could help you skin that. Oh, that's a pretty cool design idea. Maybe I could like, beef that up a little bit. And right after that meeting, they would chat about it. And I was the boss of some of the people, so I could be like, hey, well, you guys really like this on Thursday afternoon. Why don't you take Friday off and just work on it? So it was cool. But there was a point in time where some of the folks were like, hey, I know these people over in Yahoo TV. They're doing something cool. Like, could they come and show stuff? And I was like, well, did they build it in the last couple weeks? And they're like, yeah. I was like, then they meet the criteria. Bring them on. So they did. And like little by little, we basically created an underground network of all the people that actually do the stuff and who are like constantly experimenting and trying. And like we were really supporting each other in that meeting. And me as like the semi-executive at the time, because I like went to the SVP meeting, I was on that staff, so I could like tell some people to do stuff. I would just, when people had that energy on the Thursday afternoon, I'd be like, hey, why don't the three of you just like take Friday off and work on this? Sometimes they weren't even in my group, but it was fine. But here's the funky thing. On Monday morning, I had the executive meeting where I was one of the executives and the senior vice president was up there and there's all these other executives around the table and we're doing all these like little staff updates. And me having told these people, oh yes, you can experiment on the Friday, a lot of times they like send me a link. And they'd be like, oh, the prototype's done, Sunday morning or whatever. And I come to the end of my status update and be like, hey, and I have this new cool prototype to show. And I showed it to this executive staff and they're like, what in the world are you doing like every single week? There's new stuff. Do you have like thousands of engineers? I was like, no. And then they would get to like, this was a funny one. They got to the end and was like, that is so applicable to our group. And I was like, because your people built it. Right? I mean, with the help of one of my people, but still, it doesn't matter. It's like they were creating an environment that was so constrained about like whose guesses got to be at the top that they didn't allow the main currency, which is this experimental, experiential currency, to come to the fore. So even if you have limited control, you can make a meeting like that, and you can like be interacting with other people that have that type of energy. And even if you don't have the ability to bring it back to the boardroom and be like, hey, here's the prototypes from last week, you will have a richer set of things to go work with that when you go back to your own work, people will be like, hey, how come you're so much more productive? It's like, you got new ideas every week now. And they're like, real, I can experience them. That's super cool. And just like the sprint process will be like, hey, let's sketch, let's prototype. These have amazing convening and clarifying power. Right? Like when you can actually produce a thing that can be experienced as opposed to, you should just listen to me because I have the authority to talk because I have the title, then this has clarifying and convening power that talking does not have. And the more that you can like look at your schedule, remember like the optimizing the learning loop is the same sort of concept. The more that you can optimize your week so that more of the hours of the week you can produce things like that have that clarifying convening power, then the more you can kind of shift the organizational dynamic toward a lot of the stuff that people want to do in the first place. I mean, the executives are usually not mad after this change happens. They're like, well, more of the stuff we wanted to do is happening now. How did that happen? And I was like, your people on Thursday. without any of your guidance were amazing. Okay,
Right,
last
one
question.
last question.
Yes.
How do you determine if your problem is wicked, for prototype thinking?
Oh, you can do it for anything. Like, so this is the last story. Basically, when I was in Yahoo, I was an executive in the 600-person organization, and I reported up to this guy who had 9,600 people reporting to him. It was a little crazy. And, we're in this like 90-minute strategy review and about like the future of our 600-person organization and what we're going to do on product. It was product strategy, and I was like a product design type executive. And 15-minute mark into the meeting, he was like, "Hey, well, that's really fascinating. Like, couldn't you guys try something like this?" And he like, shares this idea. And I'm over at my laptop and I'm like typing it in, and it just looks like I'm taking notes. What's really happening is I'm opening up 3 messaging windows to like 2 designers and a prototyper, and I'm basically writing the idea in. And then 30 minutes later, a little less than 30 minutes later, let's say around the 42-minute mark in the meeting, I'm like, "Hey, Ari, remember that idea that you had about half an hour ago?" He's like, "Yeah, of course, the blah, 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 blah." And I was like, "Cool, you want to try it out?" And I just handed the laptop to him, and he sits down. He's like, "Oh my God, when did you make this?" I was like, "I don't know, I guess it's been about 28 minutes. And then it's like, and he goes in there more, and he's like, "This is real data." And it's like, my team. And then like, because it wasn't just a mock-up, it was like actual, functioning prototyping code with real data. And then he like finishes experiencing it, and he like scoots back from the laptop, and he's like, "I have 9,600 people reporting to me, and I have no idea how I would do this in 3 months. Like, how did you do this in 28 minutes?" And like, the reason that it relates to like what problems can you prototype for is because I prototyped everything. I like changed the layout of how I sat. Like normally executives sit around all the other powerful people. But I was like, hey, why would I sit around all these directors if a director should be a person who's talented enough to basically take a little bit of input and go work for a month independently, right? Like, why would I sit next to them and talk with them every day? They're the people that are supposed to be more independent. So I like changed it so that all like my executive staff, like directors and senior managers or whatever, they were like in a corridor that I would pass once in the morning and once in the afternoon. They didn't need more contact than that because there's senior enough people for that. The people I actually sat around, and I did have a corner office, so whatever. It's fine. So I had a corner office, but right around me was a ring of prototypers. And beyond that ring was a ring of designers and researchers. And what I would do is I would, in physical life, I would stand up and be like, "Hey, we got a quick prototype, who's available?" And then like little groundhogs, some people would pop up. And I'd be like, "Okay, Olivia, Jeremy, so-and-so." And we'd like super quickly form the team, and then they'd all pop back down and do it. And what I was doing there was virtually doing the same thing in these instant messaging windows. Now, that doesn't happen accidentally. Each one of those things, like those optimizations of physical space, of organizational design, of the fact that they even had free time, because I implemented, in parallel to Google doing 20% time, I made up a thing called 15% time, which is actually a little bit more focused, which is you can use 15% of your time to go and study anything that you feel like would be relevant for your work. And you have a little bit of budget, like learning budget for it. But the only other rule about 15% time is if there's something really critical that I need your time on to prototype, then you'll drop your 15% time for that week and give it to me to do that. And I didn't abuse it, right? So like people were like, "Oh, this is real." And because of it, I'd be like, "You have 15% time?" Yes, yes, yes. And it's like, boom, the team would form in like 14 seconds. They'd get the brief, we would do it, it would get done, and we kept iterating on our prototype systems too. It's like, how do we make it so it's really fast to access real data in a way that you could still, have privacy on like an internal cloud type thing? How do you make it so that we have lots of quick ways to iterate design? Oh, we use this grease monkey injection thing, and we created a little framework around the types of stuff that we could overlay, And like each one of these things was basically a target of multiple prototypes that led to faster, a reduction of the learning loop. And whether that is physical space or the digital like prototyping space or just the ability to go grab people's time within seconds, those were actually the culmination of a series of like 15, 20 prototypes each. And when you add all of those together, that leads to, oh, your idea is this? Okay. And then it's like, try it out. And that's what I mean. It's like it can actually be applied to anything that you would like to do faster and better. And then you can point it at self-driving cars and balloons and stuff too. Yeah. All right. I think that's it.
Thank you so much.
Yes.